November 25, 1177. The desert south of Jerusalem trembles. A 16-year-old leper king clutches his reins with bandaged hands, staring at the horizon where 26,000 men march toward him. He commands 500 knights. The mathematics of extinction stare back at him. This is not a battle. This is a funeral procession waiting to happen. 48 hours earlier, Sultan Saladin crossed into the Kingdom of Jerusalem with the largest army the Crusader states had ever faced. His objective, simple, brutal, total. Burn every Frankish village between Gaza and Jerusalem. Drag the Christian kingdom into the dirt. His scouts reported the main Crusader army was scattered across the northern frontier, chasing phantoms in Antioch. Jerusalem stood exposed. Saladin's vanguard was already torching farms within sight of the holy city's walls. Women and children fled north, carrying whatever they could. The roads choked with refugees. Smoke columns rose like black prayers. But young King Baldwin IV refused to wait for reinforcements that would never arrive in time. He gathered every available knight in Jerusalem. Templars, secular lords, mercenaries, squires barely old enough to grow beards. 500 mounted men. Against an ocean of Mamluk cavalry, Turkoman horse archers, and Syrian infantry that stretched across the coastal plain like a living carpet. The odds were 50-1. Baldwin's advisors begged him to retreat behind Jerusalem's walls. Wait for Saladin to exhaust himself. Preserve the kingdom's precious knights for a defensible siege. Baldwin refused. He understood what his counselors did not. If Saladin's army reached Jerusalem's gates unopposed, the psychological damage would be irreversible. The Crusader states survived on reputation, on the myth of Frankish invincibility. Let that myth shatter, and every Muslim ruler from Cairo to Baghdad would smell blood in the water. So the Leper King did the impossible. He rode out to meet certain death. His tiny force moved south along the coastal road, trailing Saladin's massive army like a wolf stalking a bear. On the morning of November 25th, near a ruined Byzantine fortress called Montgisard, Baldwin's scouts returned with impossible news. Saladin's army had spread out across the plain, looting villages, utterly confident no threat existed. Their formations were loose, vulnerable. For perhaps 2 hours, a window existed. A suicidal window, but a window nonetheless. Baldwin gave the order. 500 knights would charge 26,000 men. They would aim for Saladin's command position and pray that chaos could achieve what tactics never would. This is the story of the most audacious military gamble in Crusader history. The day mathematics died at Montgisard. The night before Montgisard, Baldwin's knights made camp in complete silence. No fires, no songs. Every man understood the arithmetic. 50-1 odds meant statistical extinction. Templars sharpened blades that would likely never be cleaned again. Secular knights wrote final letters to wives they'd never see. The youngest squires vomited quietly behind supply wagons, trying to hide their terror from veterans who felt exactly the same fear but had learned to bury it deeper. Baldwin himself couldn't sleep. Leprosy had already stolen sensation from his hands and feet. Soon it would take his face, his sight, everything. But tonight, wrapped in bandages beneath his armor, he felt oddly calm. He'd been dying since childhood. Death had become a familiar companion. What terrified his knights felt almost comfortable to a 16-year-old king who'd been living on borrowed time since he was 9. At dawn, scouts returned with updated intelligence. Saladin's army had continued spreading across the plain near Montgisard, looting with abandon. The Sultan himself had taken a small bodyguard unit ahead to a village called Ramla, leaving his main force scattered across miles of territory. Their discipline had dissolved into a feeding frenzy. Farms burned, livestock slaughtered. The Saracen soldiers were so confident of their numerical superiority they'd abandoned basic military caution. Baldwin saw the hand of God in this carelessness. Or perhaps just the arrogance that comes from commanding an army so large it seems invincible. Either way, opportunity had presented itself. The Bishop of Bethlehem, who'd ridden with the Crusader force carrying the relic of the true cross, declared it an omen. Divine providence had scattered the enemy like sheep before wolves. But wolves only win when they strike fast and vanish. Baldwin's 500 had no fallback position, no reinforcements, no escape route. If the charge failed to break Saladin's center immediately, if his knights got bogged down in prolonged fighting, those 50-to-1 odds would grind them into the desert sand within hours. Everything depended on speed, shock, and the psychological impact of heavy cavalry hitting unprepared infantry. Baldwin ordered his force to advance in tight formation. Lances ready. The morning sun climbed higher, turning armor into mirrors of light. Dust devils swirled across the plain like dancing ghosts. In the distance, the first Saracen scouts spotted movement. But by the time they understood what they were seeing, it was already too late to matter. The Crusaders had closed to within striking distance. Baldwin raised his bandaged hand. 500 knights lowered their lances as one. The sound came first. Not war cries or trumpets, but thunder. 500 warhorses at full gallop generate a seismic rumble that travels through earth and bone. Saracen soldiers looting a farmstead 2 miles from Montgisard felt the vibration before they saw anything. Some looked up confused. Others ignored it, too focused on plunder. By the time the first screams erupted, the Crusader wedge was already crashing through their outer pickets. Medieval heavy cavalry wasn't just fast. It was apocalyptic. A fully armored knight on a destrier warhorse weighed nearly a ton. Lances designed to punch through mail struck with the force of small artillery. The initial impact didn't just kill men, it erased them. Bodies launched backward. Formations disintegrated. The psychological shock was worse than the physical carnage. Soldiers who'd been casually looting moments earlier suddenly faced an iron avalanche materializing from nowhere. Baldwin had aimed his charge at the densest concentration of Saracen infantry near the village of Montgisard itself. The plan was brutal simplicity. Smash through the center, create maximum chaos, and hope the enemy's numerical advantage became a liability when 26,000 men started panicking simultaneously. For the first 60 seconds, the plan worked perfectly. Crusader lances shattered Saracen shield walls like dry wood. Knights drew swords and began the terrible work of close combat. Templars, trained since childhood for exactly this kind of violence, fought with mechanical efficiency. But reality started asserting itself almost immediately. 500 men, no matter how elite, can only occupy so much space. The Saracen forces began recovering from their initial shock. Officers shouted orders. Cavalry units that hadn't been hit started wheeling around to flank the Crusaders. Turcoman horse archers, the most dangerous skirmishers in the medieval world, began circling at distance, loosing arrows into the packed Frankish formation. Baldwin's knights found themselves surrounded within minutes. The wedge that had punched so decisively into the enemy center was now an island drowning in a sea of steel. Horses screamed and collapsed. Knights fought back-to-back as Saracen soldiers swarmed from every direction. The mathematics were reasserting themselves. 50-to-1 doesn't forgive mistakes. The initial shock was wearing off, and the Crusaders were about to pay for their audacity with complete annihilation. Then the wind changed. Literally. A sudden gust from the west kicked up massive dust clouds across the plain, blowing directly into the faces of the Saracen forces trying to encircle the Crusaders. Visibility dropped to yards. Confusion multiplied. The dust storm was both salvation and curse. Saracen soldiers couldn't see their targets, couldn't coordinate, couldn't even tell friend from enemy in the choking brown fog. But the Crusaders faced the same problem. Their tight formation, their only advantage, began fragmenting as visibility dropped to arm's length. Knights lost sight of their commanders. Individual combats erupted everywhere simultaneously. The battle was devolving into 1,000 separate knife fights. Baldwin understood instantly that he was losing control. In clear conditions, 500 disciplined knights could execute coordinated tactics. In a dust storm, they were just 500 isolated men fighting for their lives. The numerical advantage would eventually tell. Saracen reinforcements were already streaming toward the sound of combat from positions across the plain. Even blinded by dust, 26,000 soldiers would eventually overwhelm 500 through sheer mass. The Crusaders needed to break contact and regroup, But there was nowhere to go. They charged deep into enemy territory with no fallback position. Retreat would mean turning their backs to the enemy, inviting a massacre. The only option was to push deeper to keep the Saracens off balance, to maintain aggression even as exhaustion began setting in. Medieval combat in full armor was brutally exhausting. After 20 minutes of continuous fighting, even elite knights were gasping, arms turning to lead, reactions slowing to fatal speeds. Baldwin made a desperate gamble. He ordered the True Cross relic raised high on its pole. The golden reliquary caught what little sunlight penetrated the dust, creating a visible rally point. Knights began fighting their way toward it, reforming around the Bishop of Bethlehem, who held the cross aloft like a beacon. The religious symbolism electrified the Christian fighters. This wasn't just tactical anymore. This was salvation itself standing on a battlefield, promising divine intervention to men who desperately needed to believe in miracles. The Saracens saw it too. That golden cross, that hated symbol of Crusader power, suddenly visible through the dust. Islamic commanders recognized its importance instantly. If they could capture or destroy the True Cross, the psychological blow would shatter Crusader morale completely. Waves of Mamluk cavalry began converging on the relic's position. What had been chaotic skirmishing suddenly acquired terrible focus. Both armies understood. Whoever controlled that golden cross would control the battle's outcome. The fight around the True Cross became a meat grinder. Mamluk cavalry, among the finest heavy shock troops in the medieval world, crashed repeatedly into the Crusader shield wall. Each wave pushed the Christians back inches. Each repulse cost lives on both sides. The dust was settling now, revealing the horrifying scope of what Baldwin's knights faced. Thousands of Saracen soldiers formed a tightening noose around the Crusader position. Escape was no longer theoretically possible. It was physically impossible. Knights fought with the energy of doomed men. When lances shattered, they used swords. When swords broke, they used maces and axes. When those were lost, they used armored fists and anything they could grab. The sensory overload was overwhelming. The metallic clash of steel on steel. The screams of dying horses, a sound that haunts veterans for decades. The iron smell of spilled vitality mixing with dust and sweat. Men stopped being individuals and became instruments of violence operating on pure instinct. Baldwin himself fought in the center, his leprosy-numbed hands gripping his sword through sheer will. He couldn't feel the weapon anymore, could only watch his bandaged hands and trust muscle memory. Several times Saracen soldiers broke through to within striking distance of the young king. Each time Templar bodyguards intervened, paying with their lives to buy seconds. The mathematics were inexorable. 500 was becoming 400, then 350. The Crusaders were being systematically erased. But something strange was happening in the Saracen army. The initial coordination was fracturing. Units that should have been pressing the attack were hesitating, confused by contradictory orders. Messengers galloped between formations, but their messages conflicted. Some commanders ordered full assault. Others called for withdrawal and regrouping. The chaos that should have been the Crusaders' death sentence was spreading to their enemies. The vast Saracen army, stretched across miles of territory when the battle started, couldn't concentrate its power effectively. Different units kept arriving piecemeal, attacking independently, getting chewed up by desperate Crusader counterattacks. The dust storm had done more damage than anyone realized. It hadn't just blinded soldiers. It had severed communication across Saladin's entire army. And Saladin himself, the one commander who could have coordinated this massive force, was miles away in Ramla with only his bodyguard, completely cut off from the battle, destroying his army. 3 miles away, Saladin received the first accurate reports of what was happening. A tiny Crusader force had somehow materialized in the middle of his army and was causing catastrophic disruption. His initial reaction was dismissive. 500 knights couldn't possibly threaten 26,000 men. His commanders were overreacting. But as more messengers arrived, each more panicked than the last, reality penetrated. This wasn't just a raid. The Crusaders had struck at the exact moment and place where his army was most vulnerable. And without his direct command, His forces were fighting as independent units rather than a coordinated whole. Saladin made the decision that would haunt him for years. He began riding back toward Montgisard with his bodyguard. But 3 miles on horseback, even at full gallop, takes time. Time the battle wouldn't grant. By the time Saladin could reach the field and restore order, the outcome would already be decided. He was about to learn the terrible lesson that command and control matters more than numbers. An army without its brain is just a mob in uniform. Back at Montgisard, the Crusaders sensed a shift. The pressure wasn't increasing anymore. It wasn't decreasing either, but it had stopped building. The Saracen attacks were coming in waves rather than a continuous crush. Between waves, seconds existed to breathe, to drag wounded behind the lines, to redistribute weapons from the fallen. The bishop still held the true cross high, and men kept fighting toward it like moths to flame. The religious fervor was becoming tactical doctrine. As long as that cross stood, knights who should have been dead kept finding reasons to survive one more minute. A Templar sergeant, covered in the aftermath of close combat, approached Baldwin with impossible news. The Saracen left flank was collapsing. Not retreating in good order, but actually breaking apart in panic. Units were fleeing the field entirely. The sergeant couldn't explain it. Neither could Baldwin. But 500 knights don't question miracles. They exploit them. Baldwin gave an order that should have been suicide. Charge again. Every man still capable of sitting a horse would form up and hit the wavering Saracen flank. This wasn't tactics. This was faith-made military doctrine. The Crusaders mounted their exhausted warhorses one more time. 200 knights, maybe less, all that remained combat-capable. They formed a ragged wedge and charged into an army that should have swallowed them whole. The second charge was nothing like the first. There was no thunder of fresh hooves, no pristine lances, no psychological shock. Just 200 battered men on exhausted horses, hitting an enemy that outnumbered them 100 to 1. By every military principle ever written, this should have been the moment the Crusaders finally died. The Saracen forces, even disorganized, had enough mass to simply absorb the impact and crush the Christians through attrition. But panic is contagious. When the Crusader remnant smashed into the wavering flank, something broke in the Saracen psychology. These Christian devils who should have been dead hours ago kept coming. The Muslims had hit them with everything, surrounded them, outnumbered them impossibly, and still they charged. It stopped making tactical sense and started feeling supernatural. The whispers spread through Saracen ranks like wildfire. Divine intervention. God was fighting for the Christians. How else could 500 defeat 26,000? Islamic soldiers who'd fought bravely for hours suddenly lost their nerve. Not because they were cowards, but because the universe seemed to be violating its own rules. First one unit broke, then another. The panic spread faster than any commander could contain it. Within minutes, entire formations were routing, streaming away from the battlefield in complete disorder. The collapse fed on itself. Soldiers who might have stood their ground saw their comrades fleeing and made the rational decision to flee too. Saladin arrived at the edge of the battlefield just in time to watch his army disintegrate. He tried to rally units, personally riding among the fleeing soldiers, shouting orders, even striking men with the flat of his sword to shame them into fighting. Nothing worked. The rout had achieved critical mass. His bodyguard had to physically drag him away as Crusader cavalry began pursuing the scattered remains of what had been, just hours earlier, the largest Muslim army assembled in decades. Saladin escaped, but barely. His royal tent, his treasury, his personal effects, everything was abandoned on the field. For Baldwin and his surviving knights, the victory was incomprehensible. They'd ridden out expecting to die gloriously. Instead, they'd shattered an army 50 times their size. Knights collapsed from their horses, too exhausted to even celebrate. Some wept. Others stared blankly at the carnage around them, trying to process what had just happened. The battlefield was littered with the detritus of Saladin's broken army. The pursuit was merciless. Crusader knights, who minutes earlier had been surrounded and dying, now hunted fleeing Saracens across the coastal plain. Medieval cavalry pursuing routed infantry is slaughter, not combat. Men cut down from behind. Formations trampled. The Crusaders showed no mercy because they understood they'd never get another opportunity like this. Saladin's army wasn't just defeated. It was being destroyed as a fighting force. Every Mamluk killed now was one less elite soldier Jerusalem would face in future battles. The killing continued until darkness and exhaustion finally stopped it. Knights who'd been fighting since dawn literally couldn't lift their weapons anymore. Horses collapsed and refused to rise. The Crusaders staggered back toward Montgisard in groups, many so disoriented they got lost in the darkness. Some didn't make it back until the following day. When morning came and commanders attempted to count their forces, the numbers seemed impossible. 3/4 of Baldwin's knights had survived. Against 50-1 odds, in a battle that should have been complete annihilation, the Crusaders had lost maybe 150 men while inflicting thousands of casualties on Saladin's army. Saladin's retreat became a nightmare. Without organization, without supplies, his soldiers scattered across hostile territory. Crusader garrisons that had been preparing for siege suddenly found themselves hunting disorganized groups of starving Saracens. Bedouin tribes, always ready to profit from others' misfortune, ambushed Muslim stragglers. Of the 26,000 men Saladin led into the Kingdom of Jerusalem, only a fraction made it back to Egypt. The rest died on the field, in the pursuit, or during the chaotic retreat. The political impact was seismic. Saladin, who'd been building a reputation as the Muslim world's greatest military leader, had been humiliated by a teenage leper. His credibility among the fractious Muslim states was badly damaged. Plans to unite the Islamic world against the Crusaders had to be postponed for years. The aura of inevitable Muslim victory, building since the Second Crusade's failure, evaporated at Montgisard. For Baldwin, victory brought only temporary relief. His leprosy continued its relentless progression. Within a year, he'd be unable to ride. Within 5, he'd be blind and barely able to speak. But on November 25, 1177, a 16-year-old dying king had achieved the impossible. He'd saved Jerusalem and bought the Crusader states another decade of survival through one of the most audacious military gambles in history. The days following Montgisard turned into a desperate race. Crusader forces tried to capitalize on their impossible victory, while Saladin's scattered army tried to escape Christian territory. Every castle garrison, every Templar outpost, every minor lord with 10 knights joined the pursuit. The roads back to Egypt became killing grounds. Saracen soldiers who'd survived the battle often didn't survive the retreat. Christian forces ambushed supply columns, besieged isolated units, hunted stragglers through the desert. The local Christian population, terrified just days earlier, now emerged from hiding to exact revenge. Peasants who'd fled burning villages returned to find scattered groups of Muslim soldiers and showed no mercy. Medieval warfare had no Geneva Conventions. The aftermath was as brutal as the battle itself. Saladin's wounded, left behind during the retreat, faced grim fates. Some were ransomed, most weren't. The same villages that had burned at Muslim hands now buried Muslim dead in unmarked graves. Intelligence reports reaching Jerusalem painted an almost unbelievable picture. Saladin's grand invasion force had essentially ceased to exist as a coherent military entity. Of 26,000 men, perhaps 8,000 made it back to Egypt in any condition to fight. The rest were dead, captured, or deserted. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Saladin had brought the finest armor, weapons, and supplies Egypt could provide. All of it was now scattered across Palestine or in Crusader hands. The captured materials became legendary. Saladin's personal tent, so large it required dozens of poles, was erected in Jerusalem as a trophy. His war chest, meant to fund months of campaigning, filled Jerusalem's treasury. Muslim prisoners provided intelligence on Egyptian military capabilities and plans. For the Crusader states, Montgisard wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a windfall of resources and information that would advantage them for years. But the human cost cut both ways. Christian casualties, though miraculously light relative to the odds, still hurt a kingdom that couldn't afford to lose knights. Every crusader who died at Montgisard was irreplaceable. Jerusalem didn't have the population to easily absorb losses, and Baldwin himself was dying faster now. The exertion of combat had accelerated his leprosy. He'd bought his kingdom time, but at the cost of whatever years might have remained to him personally. Montgisard entered legend immediately. In churches across Europe, priests told the story as proof of divine intervention. 500 against 26,000 wasn't just a victory. It was a miracle. Modern historians argue about what really happened. Some credit the dust storm. Others emphasize Saladin's overconfidence and poor coordination. Military analysts point to the psychological impact of heavy cavalry shock tactics. They're all partially right. But none of those factors alone explain how Baldwin's tiny force destroyed an army 50 times its size. The truth is that Montgisard was a perfect storm of circumstances that will probably never be replicated. An enemy army overextended and careless. A desperate commander willing to attempt the impossible. Terrain and weather that magnified confusion. And yes, perhaps a dose of fortune so extreme it looked like divine favor. Medieval people called it God's will. We might call it the single most improbable military outcome in Crusader history. Either way, Baldwin IV earned his place among history's great battlefield commanders. For Saladin, Montgisard was a humbling education. He learned never to underestimate Frankish heavy cavalry. Never to let his army disperse in enemy territory. Never to separate himself from his command structure during active operations. Those lessons, purchased so expensively, made him a better general. 9 years later, at the Battle of Hattin, Saladin would avenge Montgisard by destroying the entire Crusader field army and capturing Jerusalem. But he never forgot the Leper King who'd beaten him when victory should have been impossible. Baldwin died in 1185, at age 24. Leprosy had reduced him to a barely living corpse who ruled through pure force of will. But he'd given the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem 8 more years of survival. In medieval terms, that was everything. His victory at Montgisard ensured the Christian presence in the Holy Land endured long enough for the Third Crusade to attempt its rescue. Without Baldwin's impossible gamble in 1177, Jerusalem might have fallen a decade earlier, changing the entire trajectory of the Crusades. The battlefield at Montgisard today is agricultural land. Nothing marks where 500 knights held back 26,000. But the story endures as one of history's most improbable military victories. A testament to what audacity, desperation, and a willingness to risk everything can achieve against impossible odds. Sometimes mathematics lie. Sometimes the smaller force wins. And sometimes a dying teenage king achieves immortality in a single afternoon of incomprehensible violence. That's the legacy of Montgisard. The day David beat Goliath. Again.